Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of True Restoration Live. I'm your host, Frankie Logue, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Stephen Heine, a helper at Most Holy Trinity Seminary, and Matthew Gaskin, a Brit gone American. Very great to be with you today.
It's true.
Nice to be here, Frankie. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So what we're going to be discussing today, the title is this the best that England has? There was a thread that came up on X, formerly Twitter, a few weeks ago. It's in the comments, and it discussed the differences in attitude regarding entrepreneurship, business, and risk-taking in United Kingdom, the US, and I think we can also discuss the rest of Europe a little bit as well. I think this is really important for a lot of reasons. I think it's good, as we've discussed in a previous live, for trad men to be competent in their fields, to be successful and take risks. I think also when it comes to helping out priests where we can, there's some differences in attitude that I think could be interesting to discuss. So I want to get started by talking about the first point, which it mentions, which is an openness to discussing money. This is the big thing. I noticed something that stuck out to me was Queen of All Saints Chapel in Pennsylvania, and it happened in Brooksville as well. Every week it will say the operating costs, the income, and they'll compare it to a week ago, the monthly average, a year ago, and so on. And I did mull that, having that in England. And Father Gilchrist told me, no way, because in Britain we're so uneager to talk about money. So I don't know if any of you have anything to share with that, but it's very interesting.
I was going to say I'll go second, but you can't say you're going to go second and then start talking. So I will say, as an American who's very attuned to that rise and fall and keeping the laity involved, I was even surprised the first time that I saw that. So I did not, for the majority of my traditional Catholic life, I have not attended Bishop Sanborn chapels. I would say my greatest amount of time has been spent between SSPX, who don't do that, and the IMBC, who certainly don't do that. I can tell you that in a French-Italian religious congregation would die. They would die the death before they would ever do something like that. And that just speaks to what you're talking about, a big cultural difference. So I would say even in America, where we're quite open, there are people who in America would say, oh, that's terrible that you do that. And I remember asking the bishop about this, actually not that long ago, and he said, it's their money. Do people not want to know about how the chapel is doing? It isn't some magical thing that goes somewhere and the priests figure it out and money rains down secretly. That transparency matters if you want to know how you're doing. And he said those numbers, then when you see that it was down mysteriously, next week it's higher. Because people they look and say, well, we as a group, we have failed, because you have the numbers against last March, for example. Say, well, last March we gave more. Why didn't we? And maybe, something happened. Maybe there was a person who gave a bequest, or they gave generously because some prayer had been answered, and maybe that didn't repeat this year. There's all sorts of reasons why. But the point is, those reasons aren't published. All you have are the numbers. And so I respect, and what Father Gilchrist said, I totally stand behind, and I understand why the IMBC wouldn't do that. But what that does is it also creates a tendency that it's shameful to talk about it, that money is some taboo subject that Catholics cannot speak about, certainly not with their priests. No priest I know of in any country ever has complained about getting too much money from the faithful. I have never heard that, and I've been to the traditional mass on multiple continents, and I've never heard a priest complain. You know what, Stephen? The faithful just give us too much money. I don't know what to do with all of this money. If I only knew what we could do with all this money, it would be a great help. So I don't think that that's a big problem, but I do totally understand that the British can't do that culturally, and it would be stupid to do that.
No, absolutely. I think I want to draw Matt in here as well. So going on from, issues related to parish life and mission life onto secular realms of business, something I noticed in the UK, it's just not very socially acceptable to discuss salaries. And oftentimes to my mind, I'm a little bit American this way. It seems to me a way to make sure that people aren't getting paid too much, you could say. I think if people discuss their salaries, then they kind of constantly know, okay, what am I worth? Where do I stack up? And we're in a situation where in the UK, if you earn more than £40,000 a year, which in dollars, let's say it's 50,000, that's seen as pretty wild, pretty crazy, and you should be taxed quite a lot of money. So I don't know. I think that there's an attitude of kind of shamefulness towards doing a little bit too well, and people don't want to discuss it, perhaps out of fear of doing too well relative to their peers. I don't know, Matt. You've worked on both continents in both countries. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I don't. First of all, I might live in America, Frankie, but I'm drinking tea like any good Englishman should. Yorkshire tea, although they're a little work sometimes. Right, I'm not typically English. Then I don't have a problem looking at the bulletin on a Sunday and seeing how much money has been given. But I was a little, maybe I've just got used to it, because I think I was a little surprised at first. But then it really comes down to, well, what is money? Money is a proxy for your ability to create. Or a better definition I like actually comes from Michael Saylor. It says, money is just a store of human energy. And so if you see that number, all that number means, understand, is how much of the parish's energy have they given to the church that week. Now they give it in lots of other ways as well. They give it in terms of their time a lot, and in terms of their in terms of good works that they do for the parish and for the mission, however it may be. But my own experience with that was in the UK, Frankie, as I'm sure you're very familiar with. When I was the mission coordinator in the UK, we had a bank account, and there were some people who wanted to see every penny that was being given. Even though these people were giving maybe £10-20 a month, they wanted to see where the money was going. So, well, actually, most of the money going into the account was mine, and and I was obviously spending it wisely. So. And that brings me on to the discussing salaries. No, it's not something that we talk about in the UK. I never, you'd never ever talk about that kind of thing. But I think that the broader question that we're going to talk about, kind of comes into it. I think that obviously there are quite a few cultural differences between the US and the UK, but I think one of them is, I believe it comes from the post-empire. When America was growing and when Britain was shrinking, America was about, how can I maximize my gains? Whereas the British mentality is, how can I minimize my losses? How can we? So the UK has a very, very risk-averse culture, and they don't really like it if you do well. If you do really well in the UK and you go and buy a nice car, if that's your thing. I'm not really that bothered about cars, but if you go and buy a nice car in the UK, you kind of want to be careful where you park it, because somebody's going to key it just because it's a nice car. Wow. And although that might happen in the US, it might do in a big city perhaps. You are much more likely to get, that's a really nice car, man. Well done, really, well done, good for you. They're happy for you. Whereas in the UK, there tends to be this idea that you must be ripping somebody off. You have to be. Well, maybe, but maybe you've just found a niche where you can add an awful lot of value. Maybe you're very, very skilled, and you've spent years and years and years honing your craft and becoming really, really effective at generating the value that you generate for people. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing shameful in that. You don't see doctors getting, I feel so bad about earning $500,000 a year. They don't feel bad about it because they've spent a lot of time working on that kind of stuff. You don't see bankers saying, I feel terribly bad about the £2 million bonus I got paid this year. If you're a trader at a big bank in the City of London. Some of them might feel bad about it. Look up Gary Stevenson on YouTube if you want to know what feeling bad about it feels like. But yeah, I think that there is a bigger cultural difference. To summarize what I just said, I personally don't have a problem with discussing money. I actually think it's kind of a healthy thing to show how much energy is the parish giving to the church, and maybe in that way I'm kind of a little not typical British, I would say.
No, I think that's certainly true. Something that's quite common a retort in the UK is a trust fund baby or something like that. So if someone's wealthy, particularly in the case of, say, they've got a nice car, they're either a trust fund baby, they've got a rich father, or they're a drug dealer or something like that. But something you mentioned before about, the US saying, how can I maximize my gains, and the UK, how can I mitigate my losses? I think that's certainly true, particularly in the north of England, to be frank. It's a region that, since the post-industrial revolution era, has been in decline because it hasn't managed to innovate in the same way that it used to in the past. And a lot of government policy, I think, has been orientated towards propping it up, keeping it exactly the same, and nothing changes, and we can still be wealthy. But something I want to
nothing changes except the population, Frankie. I think that
exactly. I'm not necessarily someone that believes in infinite growth, but there is certainly a belief that if you've gotten wealthy, instead of perhaps growing the pie, it's because you've stolen someone else's slice, which of course isn't always true. But another big difference that the thread mentions is a belief in possibility. Now, I don't want to say that every problem which the UK has and every benefit which the US has is due to a difference in attitude alone. But part of me thinks that we can't insult America so much if they're doing better than us in a lot of different ways, objectively speaking. Something I admire from America on the part of Americans and on the part of American clergy is the moment someone suggests an idea, it's okay, how can we do it? What should we do? How are we going to do this, and how quickly are we going to do it? Whereas perhaps on the continent more so, I think, than in Britain, but also in Britain, there is every excuse under the sun given as, okay, well, we can't do it because of this, and then because of that. So instead of saying, let's make it happen, it's more, oh, well, let's be realistic, which I often think translates to let's be pessimistic. I don't know if you have thought about
that. Stephen, when you finish laughing.
Well, there's two tracks I can take to this. One, I often refer that America, we're a childish nation in many ways, but part of being there's a negative side to that. Positive side is children believe in possibilities. We don't know what we don't know, and part of that is tied to America's frontier growth. De Tocqueville talked about this when he wrote Democracy in America. He visited in the 1830s. He was only here for 9 months, but if you read that book, he really understood America. And Matt and I have shared some laughs about some of the quotes in that book, in which de Tocqueville is trying to say, oh, I like America. And then the American is like, well, but don't you think it's the greatest country ever? Effectively. I think this was happening in the 1830s. Americans were saying this to foreigners, effectively. But children believe in possibilities, right? So part of the good childlike aspect of Americans is we do believe in that. And I've shared this phenomenon. At least when I was growing up, you could ask any kid, do you think you could become president of the United States? And the answer was always yes, I could if I wanted to, right? The idea being that path is open to anyone. And that, if I were to pivot around and say that to the French, who I lived with for a decade, they would say, well, only if I went to specific schools or I knew specific people or my last name. The idea of how much a last name plays into your resumes in France, that somebody is going to get an interview. And somebody who has, shall we say, a different last name may not. And the class system is much more present in Britain. The idea that the way that you talk in an interview would figure out whether you get that job or not, that an American, we don't think about that because we don't have developed accents the way that you all do, in which someone say, oh, that person went to a very fancy school. I'm going to hire that person.
I knew a guy at school who... and I just went to, regular state school. He went off to Edinburgh University, which is a decent university. I went to Newcastle, he went to Edinburgh. I don't know what he studied, but I was walking through Baker Street tube station on the way to work when I was still living in Surrey and working in London, and I saw him. And Jeremy, sorry, I just named it. Well, nobody's going to know who it is. But anyway. He won't be watching this.
Jeremy.
And I said, hi, how's it going? And he said, oh, yeah, I'm very well, thank you. How are you? And he spoke perfectly, Leicestershire before, not really strong Leicester, but Leicestershire, nothing, not very common, not very posh. But he'd been to Edinburgh, and I think he was working at UBS at the time. And so he suddenly started talking like this, because that's what you're expected to do. And unless you're exceptionally gifted, like Gary Stevenson. And then you can go and walk into your job in Citibank, and it doesn't matter how you talk because you're going to make the bank millions and millions of pounds. So if you're very, very gifted, it doesn't really matter. But you are right, Stephen. We still have that hangover.
And the other aspect of the what if I could, why don't I just try something? The other aspect is for Americans, because we're a younger country and we have a much smaller period of history to draw on, the idea of reinventing yourself, if I fail, so what? There's no social risk. So when I would talk to the French about, hey, you should try this idea or you should try this business, I even remember somebody who was saying he loved Quebec so much. And I said, well, why don't you go? And he says, oh, it's too late now. Like he was in his 40s. And so in the French mind, like, oh, 40, it's too late. My life's over. So if they had wanted to try a business that they were pitching to me, the idea was, what if I fail at that business? And it was fascinating because this is something I grew up with in Asia, is the loss of face is an enormous social thing. Like losing face, like you would rather do anything rather than lose face. And in that translates in France to this risk aversion. And I'm not saying that French culture and Chinese culture are the same. I'm just saying reading this risk aversion through different lenses, the French cannot accept the idea of the idea that their friends and family would look down on them. And in America, it's not as if your friends and family wouldn't, but the idea is, well, pick yourself up and move forward. That would be the response of most Americans. Hey, you know what? And classic example, when this is in your schooling, an American sheet of paper could be entirely marked up all over. And at the bottom, it says, nice try, better luck next time. Something along these lines, like encouragement. The French one, if you look at the equivalent, it's all marked in red, like go home and die. You're a disgrace to your family. Like this is how the French would finish it, right? And if there are a bunch of red marks on a Chinese thing, you don't go home. Like it's over for you. So Americans can start over if I fail. So in a sense, there's no risk. We don't think about it, I think, as gravely. Part of that is English and French have centuries of history, centuries of expectation. And so it's a lot harder to say, well, so what if I fail? It's easy for Americans. We don't have a lot of history. Nobody expects that much of us.
No, I think that there's a lot to be said for a flatter hierarchy, and it allows for social mobility. Something that strikes me, say, in the venture capital world of Silicon Valley, aside from whatever political issues may go on there, from a strictly business point of view, loads of them fail all the time. And they'll just keep going and try something else. And eventually they'll maybe start their tech unicorn or whatever the case may be. Something I think that is praiseworthy in Britain, or at least was until a socialist government sought to get rid of them, was the concept of a grammar school. And these were state-funded schools. They still exist in Birmingham. I went to one in Kent, in Northern Ireland, and a few other places. And essentially, you can take a test. You don't have to, but if you want to, you can take an exam. If you score well enough, you get in. You're surrounded by smart kids. You don't have to pay anything. And what I went to school surrounded with was a bunch of people who came from similar backgrounds to myself. Maybe their father was working class, or he'd crawled his way up to the middle class, tooth and nail. And they all went on to do, very good things. They would study medicine, or they'd be interested in business as well. So there was that element there, which I thought I always was happy that I went to one, and it certainly left an impression on me. So I think it's not game over. I don't know.
A university. I mean, again, I went to Newcastle, and it was absolute. Well, first of all, the kids who went to private school, that was just transparent. They kind of rolled in wearing their chinos and their shirt sleeves rolled up with their sweater across their shoulders, and the girls wore their pink pashminas, and they had the uniform and they wore it. But then you had the kids who didn't go to private school but went to grammar school, and it was very, very transparent who those kids were over the difference between private schools, grammar schools, and then the comprehensives. I went to a comprehensive, but when you were talking to somebody from a grammar school, you could tell the difference. It was a much, much better education, obviously. So no, they were a great thing, but of course, I forget which. Obviously, some Lib Dem or Labour female MP said it was their mission to destroy every last grammar school in the country.
Yeah, I mean it's usually the parents who couldn't get into one or their children couldn't.
Yeah.
That's the trope anyway. Not always accurate, but it's the trope.
Probably reasonably accurate.
Moving back to the UK and US, Matt, you spoke about this earlier when people have a nice car, they say, how did you do it? Or Stephen, I think you mentioned it as well. Something that the thread mentioned was the focus on learning. So if someone does something really well, if they have some great success, perhaps in America, they might ask, how did you do that? That's so awesome. But in the UK, they might just be like, oh, okay, go on then. You had your lucky break. So it seems that in the UK, aside from inherited wealth, created wealth is kind of seen as an accident that couldn't happen to someone like me. In the same way that we think something bad will never happen to me, my house will never burn down. I think a lot of people in England and Scotland, in particularly, think, oh well, that'll never happen to me. I don't know if you two have any thoughts on that.
I think that well, I can only speak for myself. So, I mean, again, I went to comprehensive, and you are given some pretty shocking advice at school in terms of career, and that kind of locks you into that mentality. Oh, it can never happen to me. You're told, if you go to university and you get a degree, you'll be just fine in life. And maybe you will, but you are unlikely to be a real high achiever. Let's be frank. You'll probably be fine. You'll maybe be able to afford a house eventually. With the UK's house prices, but you're never going to do really, really, really well. So that idea of if you do really well, it's probably because you didn't follow the system. You didn't do what you were told to do. We were told, go to university, get a degree. X% of graduates earn X% more than non-graduates in their lifetime when you're given all that stuff, and it kind of locks you into that path. And unless you have people around you giving you really good advice, that's not necessarily that, you're not going to know. So obviously, I still have family that live in the UK. My brother lives there, and he says all the people he knows who do really well are all tradesmen. Now, of course, there are doctors, dentists, lawyers, accountants, engineers who do well. But a lot of the people who did really, really well are tradesmen, and just very, very smart, very skilled tradesmen who do a really good job, and then figure out eventually how to, maybe they get someone to say, "Hey, could you just do that for me?" And then they figure, "Oh, hang on, I can earn a lot more money with being a business," and then they learn how to run a business, and then they become really successful. I forget the name of Britain's richest plumber. That plumber, the guy who's got a plumbing company in London, he's worth hundreds of millions of pounds.
Oh yeah.
I really do think when it comes down to that'll never happen to me. It'll probably never happen to you that you'll be really poor if you follow this. If you follow the system and do what you're meant to do, you'll probably never be poor, but you'll probably never be really wealthy either. That's just a brutal reality. And I wish people, at least in the UK, I can't speak so much for the US, but I wish people in the UK had a bit more of the other side of the coin.
No, I think that's true. And I know Stephen will have a lot to say on the topic of university and universities. But I think that in the UK, and particularly I find on the continent in Europe, there is what I would perhaps describe as a public sector attitude to university. In other words, if I do this and I do the degree, I'm owed a job in a certain sense. I follow all the rules, I go to school, and then I just get a job. And something that even happens in Spain is that I think very recently, the majority of young people who go to university, and on the continent is very popular to do master's degrees as well, they will take an exam to go into the civil service because they see it as a stable job. It's fine. And it often is very fine for them, and they probably won't get fired. So I understand it from that point of view. But I see it in the UK in particular, where people will go to university and maybe not try anything outside of their studies. And then perhaps nowadays, when it's more competitive, struggle to get a job, and it's or start their own business or whatever the case may be. We certainly don't have, say, people at Oxford creating Facebook or something like that. I don't know, Stephen, if you've had any thoughts on this.
Well, the original frame and what Matt ended with, the idea of it's never going to happen to me. It's like, well, wealth never happens to anyone unless it's already happened. It already exists in your family, right? If you grew up in a wealthy family, yes, wealth happens to you. You grew up into it. But for everyone else, if you want it, you're going to have to do something different. And this harkens back to some of the themes we talked about in our very first TR Live, where you talked about, this was a thread that you put together, that you're going to have to think differently about money. This is a big deficit across all forms of education. Is financial education is not given, and so much of the modern world is tied together by finance, and let's say things are manipulated by certain people who control finance. That's a topic for another conversation. But the idea is, if I can't afford a house, so in America, the term these days is called house hacking. Do you use this term, Frankie, house hacking? So in America, the idea is I'm going to buy a larger house, but maybe I'll finish out the basement and I'll rent that out to somebody. And the rent from that will cover my mortgage payment, or a large part of my mortgage payment, so that I don't actually have to. It's even such now for underwriters, for bank loans, you can estimate the rent you will get from somebody and put that into your contributed income in America for a loan. So we even have our underwriters backing up a social phenomenon. And then people would say, oh, you'd be willing to do that? So I explained this concept to some French people and they said, oh, I don't know, Stephen, blah, 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 blah. But some of them would say, oh, that's really smart. But that idea is, well, that's not going to happen to you. But by that action, you're able to potentially afford a larger house than you could and have it be mostly subsidized. Well, that's never going to happen to you. But part of that, what could happen to you is people around you could give you some solid financial education. You can say, I could do that. I could do a side hustle. And even people who do get great wealth, they've got to stay hungry. I think of Michael O'Leary. I found this out recently. For those who don't know, Michael O'Leary runs Ryanair, one of the most innovative companies ever.
Brilliant.
His Mercedes S-Class, he found out that you don't have to have a fleet of taxis. You just have to have a taxi license. His Mercedes S-Class has a taxi license on top for one cab. That's his cab, so that he can drive in the taxi cab lane when he needs to get to and from places for meetings. So this is a man who has an expensive vehicle, and he's not ashamed to put a taxi thing on top of it and quote unquote be his own cab driver so that he can hack the law. And there's an example of, did that happen to him? Did someone say, hey, Michael, you know what you could do? You could create a cab company, make sure you're the only cab in your cab company, and now you get to drive in the cab lanes. So he stayed hungry, even though he's enormously wealthy, enormously successful, but he kept that sort of hunger around him. And that's where I would say the reframe is not, if something is going to happen to me, I'm going to have to happen to wealth. And once again, I'm showing my American tendencies. We are going to attack something. We're going to go after it. We're going to start something. It's not simply going to be handed to us ever.
No, I think that's certainly true. And I mean, Michael O'Leary is a brilliant businessman. I mean, Ryanair, in terms of their innovation, the capital they return to their investors as well, amazing firm, frankly, and I use it frequently. The fact that they managed to get airfares so cheap, incredible. Something I wanted to touch on, because you mentioned house hacking, and it's begun to make its way over to the UK in terms of vocabulary, but it's not a common thing, and I doubt that it will be. And this is not, I think, here a case of attitude towards it, but rather regulation. So, of course, government policy is downstream of the voters who vote for those parties. But we recently had for 14 years a conservative government, which wasn't so conservative, and they introduced plans to ban what's called no-fault evictions. On the face of it, the same way, if you say a Human Rights Act and then put it whatever you want in it, if someone opposes that, you can say, well, you oppose human rights. In this case, a no-fault eviction doesn't mean you're kicking someone out for no reason. It means that you can't end a tenancy agreement with someone unless they do something bad and break the rule. So you can't say, well, I want to use it now, it's my house. And so that will have the effect when it comes into force of massively disincentivizing people renting out houses or buying them and then letting them out. And I believe anyway, it will reduce supply in the rental market. But what I think is, Michael Leary was Irish, and here in Britain as well, we've had lots of innovative entrepreneurs. I think there's a saying that goes, the US innovates, Europe regulates, and China replicates. And I think that's certainly true. I think we've gained a propensity to regulate. And irrespective of the attitudes of entrepreneurs in Britain, they are often strangled by it. I know that in Spain, they were the first EU country to introduce a ministry for regulating AI. They have no well-known AI startup. I mean, you both have worked, in Britain and on the continent, so I'm sure you have, a plethora of stories about regulation.
Yeah, well, the American AI regulator would be run by an AI. So I think that's part of the difference. This goes to you talk about cultural, right? So the legal background, and there's a certain leftover of Christendom there. So, for example, in France, it's illegal to evict anybody during wintertime. Illegal. It doesn't matter how far behind it. It's illegal to kick someone out onto the street, right? And this is a leftover Christendom that would have existed during Christendom. The winter truce is what it's called. And so when you think about, the cultural aspects of how this reacts, that regulation and what comes behind it is due to needing explicit rules. So in France, if something is not, so American idea is, if it doesn't say you can't do it, you can. So if it doesn't say no U-turn, we can turn. In France, if it doesn't say you can U-turn, you cannot U-turn. So they need explicit regulations for what they are allowed to do. So in America, it's do it and maybe ask for permission, ask for forgiveness later. But we would never ask for permission. We're just going to go. With the French are paralyzed by what says I can't do this. And then I remember a comedian was talking about the Germans one time, and he said, well, one more point and I'm going to get my license suspended. And the German said, well, then you wouldn't be able to drive. And then they said, well, what if I needed to pick something up? And the German says, no, you cannot do this. And so in their mind, it's all the way, culturally embedded. And I appreciate that about the Germans, right? So the thing is, what is in your culture influences the way that you act. And so why are French businesses less innovative is because they're waiting for someone to tell them that they can do that. And so there are so many copycat apps in France, which are simply straight up copies of an American app, where the French people, their value add is they know the market. So they're going to create. And so that's why I'm always so impressed when I see apps that are entirely European created. But even then, you'll see, once again, leftovers from Christendom taken to socialist ends. BlaBlaCar is the example I will give. BlaBlaCar is an absolutely brilliant idea. And for Americans who don't know about it, it's basically long distance Uber, but it cannot be for profit. So you're going to drive to Amsterdam in the morning. It's 4 hours from Paris. No, sorry, it's longer than that. But you then advertise, I've got 2 seats available. I'm charging this much for gas. The app limits you for what you can charge based on what the app knows how long it is and what gas prices are. So you can't charge what you want. But what it does is it allows people to come off of buses, trains, or whatever, and you can specify, I listen to no music, don't talk to me, I like pets, I listen to rock music, I smoke, whatever else. And then people can choose, and then you get rated and you rate the driver, etc. That is an excellent app, but it's built for Europe. Europe is a deeply connected continent. You could drive for 8 hours and still be in the state of Texas. 8 hours, nonstop. And so BlaBlaCar, I realized the reason it wasn't invented in America is because we don't have the same need for BlaBlaCar. And there's an example of, and even then you could see the innovation was trapped by regulation. So innovation can happen, but in Europe these days, it's entirely strangled by regulation. And obviously the opposite side is in America, where we don't have this regulation and fishes get killed and forests get killed off. That's the bad side of it. And obviously Christendom would offer something in between. So Europe still has that leftover Christendom. So there's some good instincts, but taken to socialist ends, then we get, you can't evict somebody who hasn't paid you for 10 years because that's illegal. Okay.
No,
I'm against human rights, I guess.
No, exactly. And man, I'm sure you can comment more on the difference between the UK in particular and Europe and America. But something I noticed as well is Spotify is a great example of another European company. It starts in Sweden. I started in Sweden, I believe. And even the popular video game Minecraft, that was a Swedish video game developer. I think he was Swedish. So there's some innovation going on, particularly in the Nordics and the Baltics as well. There's some, I think Bolt, the taxi company, is from Latvia or Estonia. I think it's Estonia. So there's some degree of entrepreneurship going on in Europe, but the moment that they grow to a certain level, they either get acquired by an American company or they list on the New York Stock Exchange as opposed to the London Stock Exchange or the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Because I think the American capital markets are so deep, because investors there are willing to take a risk, say on a European company, whereas in the UK and the rest of Europe, we are just more risk averse, as was said earlier. I don't know, Matt, if you had anything to add on regulation or perhaps growth in businesses in the UK versus the US.
Well, I mean, I worked for a large American company when I lived in the UK, and I left there to go to seminary. But when I came back after 3 months, I wasn't there for very long. When I came back, It was coincidental. My old boss emailed me and said, "Hey, would you like to come back?" And I said, "Yeah." But I don't want to be a permanent employee. I've never really been the kind of, even though I've always worked for big companies, although I don't anymore. I've always worked for big companies. I was never the kind of person to put the lanyard around my neck in the morning with my little name badge and say, "Hi, I'm Matt, and I am, I work for XY big, huge transnational corporation." And I'm so proud to be here. To me, it was always a job. It was always a business relationship. I work for them; they pay me. But I went back and I said, "Yeah, sure, but I'll come back as a contractor because I don't want to be a permanent member of staff." I mean, it's no secret. It was Cubic. It was a company called Cubic. It's on my LinkedIn profile. People can just look at it. It's I'm not hiding anything. I didn't want to be a cube. Because that came over from America. Oh, hi cubes. Some things do not travel well across the Atlantic. Cube is one of them. And a load of Brits sitting in an office being referred to as cubes. We're just thinking, what are they going on about? So anyway, I came back at a time before the IR35 rules got all tied up. So I was able to be a contractor, set up my own limited company in the UK with just me as an employee, and provide contracted services back into Cubic. I did that for about 2.5 years. And it was really, really easy to set up a limited company. It was very simple to find an accountant and get the accounts done. And all I really had to do was, invoice them every month and provide some paperwork to my accountant every now and then. And it wasn't a very difficult thing to do. But of course, the IR35, and there had been people at that company who'd been there for years and years and years and were making more than the MD as contractors. That's all stopped now. Because you can't have that because, it's no secret. Back then you would pay yourself the minimum salary, below the first tax threshold, so it'd be like £10,000–11,000 a year, and then you pay the rest. You pay the rest in dividends, which of course you pay less tax on. But the government didn't like that because the government wants more tax. So they strengthened the IR35 rules up to make sure that you couldn't do that. And, so if you've been working for a company as a contractor for, I think it was more than a year or maybe 2 years, you had to become a permanent member of staff or pay permanent member of staff levels of income tax. And that just kind of kills, it kind of kills innovation because companies will employ people who they think provides the best value for them. Now, eventually, when that rule came in, they offered me a permanent position again, and I thought, okay, well, fair enough. Because what choice do you have? You're only going to end up paying a huge amount of tax anyway, so it wouldn't have made it really worth it. So they offered me a permanent position, which I took, and then I came, and I only did that for about a year before I eventually, moved over to the US. But I do feel in the US, I mean, I live in Florida, so there's no state income tax in Florida. I mean, for Brits in the US, you pay tax to the federal government. That's the one in DC, and you pay tax to the state government. And lots of states charge income tax on your income. Florida doesn't. It's one of the few states that doesn't do that. So, for me, it feels a little more financially free here anyway. but on the other hand, you do have to live in a swamp full of mosquitoes. So it's not all good, but I would say the general attitude towards commerce in the US.
I'm just thinking there's going to be that poor man who was hurt last time.
We're going to get more comments. That's exactly what I was thinking. but on the other hand, so, it is a lot freer. It is a lot freer, and it does feel freer. And the Americans have just a different way of doing things. Some things are better, some things are worse. But I would say in the area of entrepreneurship and what's possible, as long as you have a thick skin and you don't really care about what people think about you, and you don't really care if you fail, and you don't care about what people are going to think about you if you fail, I would argue that the US is a better place to be for starting a business that's going to be successful. Of course, what you can do in the UK, I know somebody who's doing this, is start a tech startup. If it does well, you're going to make a lot of money, and then you can just get a visa to the US. Because if you come over here with like $1 million and say, I'm going to buy a Chick-fil-A franchise and employ a load of Americans, the USCIS will just say, fine, come on in, give us your money. So money talks in the US. Whereas because they're a lot more transparent about it. Because
that's the most important thing to us, Matt. You have to give mind. It's our national religion.
Well, yeah, but I mean, who am I to criticize that? That came from the English, came from the Protestant mercantilist English. So I'm not gonna.
I want to pick up on a couple of threads that Matt left there. So, for example, Frankie, tax avoidance. That is an epithet that UK politicians will say, oh, so-and-so is a tax avoider. Do you know that idiom doesn't exist in American English?
Really? Wow.
We don't. It's called having a good accountant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We don't. There's no term like if you try to accuse someone of being a tax avoider, an American, what is a tax avoider? We would think you meant tax evasion.
Yeah.
But the term tax avoider and thinking you can use that against us in America, when we are a country ostensibly founded on a tax revolt, it is no crime to avoid tax in America. It just means that you know the tax code, which is mostly built for small businesses and large businesses too. It's built around for businesses. So tax avoidance is not a crime in America, morally or legally. The other aspect, what Matt was saying about how it's easier to start a business in America, I've often said we get many things wrong as Americans, but what we don't get wrong is business. We really get that right. And part of that, I'll illustrate. A French corporation, when you start one up, you have to start paying social charges on day one. No employees, no revenue. You give us money. You know that meme that goes around where the guy's like got his hand out and he's pointing to his hand, right? Yeah. That's the French government the moment you start a business, right? And the idea is in America, we're not going to tax you unless you have a profit. If you lost money, you could run a business for a couple of years and pay no taxes, partially because you're trying to get stood up and actually be in a position where you would pay taxes. But even then, that wouldn't be your primary concern as a U.S. business.
And maybe you've just got a really good accountant too.
You could have a really good accountant, and Matt and I know somebody. Get in touch with us afterwards. But the idea is, you get to focus on building your business, not on am I going to do this. And there's a British comedian. She lives in France, and I shared this with a few people who are also we own businesses in France, and she said, in France we don't say boo, we say URSAF. And if you don't know, URSAF is like the French equivalent of HMRC, right? And that would be the scary thing to say to somebody. And it just indicates to you, no one feels that way about the Small Business Administration in America. We have access to loans, guidance, coaching. It's all there for you because the idea is America wants to help you if you want to start a business. Mm-hmm. Though there's loans available, etc. That's just not the case in France. And again, that's neither good nor bad from a moral aspect. It's just speaking to cultural things. And there's a downstream effect. Well, if I can't help you start a business, then I have to climb an even higher mountain more mentally to do that because I'm not getting any help from my government.
On the other hand, although it is much easier to start a business and transact in the US, the banking system is pitiful compared to Europe. Compared to Europe, the UK banking system. The UK banking system it's an order of magnitude better than the U. They still send checks to each other in America, bits of paper. It's incredible. And you did. When I first got here, I did wonder, how did you manage to become the world's hyperpower if you're sending money to each other on bits of paper? And the other thing is, of course, that it is extraordinarily litigious. So if you do anything wrong in the UK, you might get a strongly worded letter, listen here, I didn't really particularly appreciate what you did there, and, I would expect better in the future. In the US, it's you get a letter saying, preserve your documents, lawyer up, we're going to go to court, I'm suing you. So,
well, to be fair, Matt, that is unless, of course, you made a Facebook post saying free Palestine, and then the UK police are going to kick down your door, right?
That's right, yeah.
So maybe not on business aspects, but other aspects,
Well, I think I remember Trump during a debate during the 2016 presidential election was pulled up for having paid, I think it was, I don't know, $750 in tax. He said, well, I have a great accountant. I know that, what's the problem?
Yeah.
And say what you want about the man, but it didn't cause, a bounce in the polls for Hillary Clinton or anything like that. Whereas in the UK, that would be, quite the scandal, I think.
Nobody ever said, even the most hardened leftist, ever said, I wish I paid the government more tax.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know, Matt, if you know, famously, Norway set up a bureau just to do that, and they closed it after a few years because nobody would pay extra tax. This is when you would volunteer to pay more tax. The Norwegians, high on their own supply, thought we're going to show how virtuous we are. And after, I think, some token contributions here and there, nobody volunteered to pay extra tax. I wonder why that is.
Amazing, isn't it? A country with millions and millions of barrels of oil offshore, and the people don't want to pay any more taxes. It's a real head scratcher.
No, definitely. One of the final things I wanted to touch on was that the thread mentioned was speed of execution. And this can be applied, I think, both to, say, building up a mission, but also to business. I remember when the UK mission was getting started back up again, and I knew that Father Duterte in Nantes was going to come and visit. And I began thinking to myself, again, in some aspects, I'm a little bit American, perhaps. You grow up with social media and the internet. And I began thinking, well, if Father flies here and then, stays the night there and says Mass there, and then comes down to the Midlands and then goes down to London, what can we fit in? Which, of course, didn't happen. And wasn't going to happen. It's just not feasible. It's not fair, I think, to impose all that on a priest. But the first thing my brain thought was, what
Father Duterte would do something like that. He is that kind of go-getter.
He would absolutely do.
Oh no, he is. He's a great go-getter. He goes everywhere. I don't know how he does it. Maybe he picked that up in America, or maybe it's part of his personality. But so I think that's a big difference. And for a long time, say, if a mission wants to start a school or open up another mass center or something like that, things move very slowly. I've heard it said in a few different circles as well that, okay, well, we have to have a meeting about it. I heard people make fun of Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, for wanting a meeting with Trump, and Trump said, well, I don't know what the meeting is going to be about. And someone said, Keir Starmer's only ever worked in the public sector. He thinks meetings equals productivity. Things move very, very slowly. So I don't know if either
he's going to have a meeting about what were you thinking supporting Kamala for the campaign.
Yeah.
I can imagine that. That's going to be a fun first conversation.
Oh, absolutely. But so I'm curious if either of you have any stories about this, either in parish or mission life, or in the business world, on the speed of execution.
So you both heard me say this in different forums. The concept of lean startup is something that I've advocated ever since I first read the book years and years ago. I've implemented it into every project, side hustle, family project I've worked on, business. The idea is you launch, you get feedback, and you iterate, right? So your audience, your market is going to tell you what it wants. Reid Hoffman, who founded LinkedIn, has said it another way. He said, if you're not embarrassed by the first version of the product you shipped, you waited too long. That the idea is not that I'm going to have committees and have it perfect and make sure that launches only if something that I would be proud of. Rather, let's get it out there and see if anyone's even interested. If no one's even interested, why do we need to polish it up and make it awesome? No one cares. So and crowdfunding really kicked off this era of lean, which is find out if the market validates it. And then what happened was the publishing industry changed. I supported a Kickstarter not that long ago for a comic series, which they had the money to publish it. But what they wanted was they wanted to find out exactly how much they needed to publish. So all these people were willing to prepay for it. They were given some incentives to do it. And then they launched. So even once that was put in place, even people who had the money and were traditionally printing books, I would say blindly, now they could say, well, we only need to print this many because here's how many people we're willing to, and here's how many we think we can sell in the open market. And so lean is something that can work for parishes, for initiatives, for family life, as well as for business. And I don't know if that has worked or been advocated for in England. I could say not to some extent in France, particularly in the tech sector.
So
yeah, I mean, in England, in terms of startups, I think, there are some pockets where you get some of that. I think Oxford and Cambridge, to their credit, some people talk of an Oxford-Cambridge arc, in terms of tech startups. You get some activity there with people willing to try things out and fail and things like that. One thing I have to praise Father Gilchrist, our resident priest in the UK, for is he is an incredible go-getter. We've spoken about it, and he praises the Americans on this. So if people want mass somewhere, he'll say, okay, well, let's go on a Saturday if we can't go on a Sunday, whereas before in England, no, that's what I mean. And if people go, then it works, but I think before that, for me, it was almost, okay, yeah, we can, why not say try the North on a Saturday, which is what
Wickham Wednesdays.
No, exactly. And we're going to do first Saturdays, which is, I think, something that for Sedevacantist in England, that's just not something they've been able to do unless they live, say, near Father Morgan in the Southwest for years, or since the death of Father Baker, for example. So he's an incredible go-getter, and I can only sing his praises on this regard. But Matt, I didn't know if you had anything to add on this, lean startup idea or the speed of execution.
Well, in my previous role, and actually for the many years, I've been a big fan of lean as it was originally developed in Japan, and I've been listening to a lot of audiobooks again about it recently. And if anybody's interested, I guess they can message in and I'll give them some recommendations. But lean is based on the three principles of respect for your customer, respect for your team if you've got one, and respect for raw materials, because of course Japan doesn't really have any raw materials apart from fish. It's based on humility, like the idea that even if you've made an improvement, there's got to be a better way. You're not at the end of the road. And the third principle is continuous improvement, that you've always got to get better. Now, you have to have naturally a lot of humility to go and do that. And that means, going back to what Stephen says, you're going to put out a product that, is going to be embarrassing at first. And then you're going to find out if there's a market for it and move on. So when I left look at my LinkedIn profile, it was Ryder. I left the last company I left in May this year before I bought the business I'm operating now. They were trying to deploy lean, and it just really wasn't, it wasn't going. I think it's fair to say it wasn't going terribly well. Because you have to have a lot of humility to say, this is wrong. We're going to try something else. We're going to try something different. We're going to put it out. Large organizations don't really have the ability to move like that, because they, the larger an organization gets, it gets more ossified and difficult to become flexible and agile. Whereas the Japanese always focused on providing value to your customers. So in the period of, leaving that company, and now just as an experiment, I put out on LinkedIn a series of videos on lean and, different principles of lean, just a minute long. Because I thought, well, I wonder if there's any interest out there for people, for people to contact me and say, hey, we're trying to do this kind of thing. Zero. Okay, so as Dan Pena would say, zero. I'll say it again. Now, what does that mean? Well, it meant that something I did was wrong. Either I wasn't offering, Lean Startup Outreach is also a very, very good book. So either the channel was wrong or the messaging was wrong, but I beta tested it with a video on LinkedIn to see how much people actually watch on LinkedIn, how long. And typical watching time is 48 seconds. That's how long you've got. So I made the videos a minute long, and on different lean principles. But I didn't have any feedback from it. Now, that approach, people say, well, that was a huge failure. No, that's part of being lean. That's kind of putting stuff out there and seeing what people actually want. Now, maybe if I use a different channel, a different communication channel, not LinkedIn, something else, maybe if I put it on YouTube, I'd get something different. But you have to be willing to just, there's a fair few 1-minute videos of me talking about lean on LinkedIn. I'm not going to take them down. I'm embarrassed about it. I put that information up. Anybody can watch it. Anybody in the world who's got a LinkedIn profile can go and watch it. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And people say, oh, well, you didn't get any business out of that, did you? Nobody phoned you up wanted to be a lean consultant or anything like that. Well, yeah, but that's not really what I was after. I was kind of gauging what the interest was. So I think to do things like that, to experiment, you have to have a degree of humility to say, well, it doesn't really matter if it succeeds or if it fails. You're really just finding out what people value. What would people actually be willing to pay for is really what you're looking for. But that brings us back to a conversation about money. And of course, as British, we don't want to talk about money. So
I want to, Frankie, I want to build off of the first Saturday thing, but I also want to go back to lean very briefly. Sure. Tim Ferriss talks about this in 4-Hour Workweek, that a way that you can test whether people in your social circle are gassing you up versus whether they're serious, like, oh, that's a great idea, Frankie, you should start a business around that, is you create a landing page that accepts someone's credit card. And at the end, it says, oh, sorry, the product's not available right now. But they've had to enter in their credit card information and hit pay, right? Mm-hmm. So he advocates, like, if you have an idea about a product or a service, build a landing page, have it so that it can take someone's credit card information, but when they hit submit, it tells them, sorry, this is not available at this time, or it's back ordered, or actually, thank you for contributing, but the product's delayed for a few months, whatever it might be. That is the only way, but that's another lean principle of, oh, I had 6 people who said they would buy this service. Well, I actually only needed 3 people to say it, so I'm going to do that. Right. So I put a couple of the books that I'm referring to there.
So there's just one more thing about, you've mentioned the Toyota Way, which is an excellent book, and Jeffrey Likert wrote another book about the Toyota Way on service excellence, because that book is very much focused on manufacturing. The service excellence book is focused on services as well. Okay. I strongly recommend both of those books.
Is it the Toyota Way / service excellence?
I don't know. I don't know why I'm looking at my shelf. It's actually my Audible. Yeah, you'll find it. The Toyota Way, something to do with service management or service excellence.
Okay.
So he mentioned something in that book. When Toyota first came over to the US, they started a joint venture with, I think it was General Motors, at the NIMI plant in California, which is now owned by Tesla. And the first thing the Japanese noticed about the Americans, and I told this to Stephen maybe a month ago now, the Japanese had a real problem, because in Japan, they see problems as being, little treasures that they get to figure out and they get to solve, and we move on and we make it, we make the whole thing more efficient. When they tried this with Americans, and in the first kind of morning meetings that they had, because in Lean you do a morning meeting, get everybody together and talk about how things are going. And when they brought up problems, it was immediate defense. We haven't got any problems. We haven't got any problems. Are you saying I've got a problem? And then they go from immediately defensive to immediately aggressive. We haven't got a problem. And the Japanese figured out that they had to say, this happened yesterday and it was really good. And this happened yesterday and that was really good too. But there was this little thing that happened over here, and maybe we could take a look at it.
We call it a compliment sandwich.
A compliment sandwich. But you had to kind of gas the Americans up to make them feel good about themselves before you could say, we have a problem here. Whereas the Japanese, it's just, hey, there's a problem, let's go fix it. So it's a cultural thing, and I think that kind of speaks to just a completely different mindset, a completely different culture.
So to finish off what you were saying about applying lean with First Saturdays and Father Gilchrist, I want to pay special tribute to the Hungarians. When Father Trauner was still living in Austria, they'd asked him, they said, can we have First Fridays and First Saturdays? He says, okay, well, if you're going to do this, I need this many people showing up. We're going to do catechism. And they committed as a chapel. And they, as a chapel, completed the First Fridays and the First Saturdays over a 9-month period with major attendance. And by the same, when the Pottstown Chapel was created here in Pennsylvania, people had asked Bishop, could we have First Friday? Could we have First Saturday? And the bishop said, well, we'll see who shows up. with the idea of if no one shows up, we're not going to keep doing it because a priest has to leave here to go do it. And if no one's coming, then we have mass here at the seminary anyway. So thankfully, people at both the Harrisburg and the Potsdam Mission have responded, and we have people at First Fridays and First Saturdays. But there was another, I mean, no one would argue Bishop Sanborn is an advocate of lean, but he was proposed a lean idea and he went with it, right? He said, well, let's see how it goes. So don't be afraid to ask your clergy for First Friday or First Saturday, but realize the market is going to prove it or not. And if none of the other faithful show up, you blame yourselves for it. It's not Father's fault that he's not doing First Fridays. It's your fault for not showing up. Because it's always nice to hear that on paper. Oh, wouldn't it be nice if we had First Fridays? And then rubber hits the road. It's like, oh, we're not actually showing up. Well, so then you don't really mean that. You don't really mean it would be nice to have First Fridays because when it came, you didn't show up. So I really want to encourage people, don't be afraid to use lean principles with your clergy, but realize you're going to have to step up to the plate if you ask that of them.
No, exactly. And who knows, maybe in a couple of weeks' time, I'll be eating my own words here. But I hope not. I also have to really praise the chapel in Hungary. I remember when a newsletter came out, they made this beautiful chapel in a house that they all bought together. Those who could contribute did, and those who could help with hard work did. And I think Bishop Sanborn wrote in the newsletter, now the man wants to start a school. So it wasn't one thing to the next. So I really have to
and note that a large part of that chapel is built with crypto, specifically Bitcoin. So I think that's one of the first use cases for that in the traditional movement.
There you go. And if it works, then nothing's wrong with it.
There's one more. There's just one more thing I want to say. I know we've gone over time, but when I first started traveling in my 30s, kind of traveled around a lot, went to Australia a lot, and Hungary, mainly thanks to Stephen. I should have started traveling more before then, but that was really when I started. I saw a lot about how other Catholics had done things around the world, and of course, I'd spent 3 months in Florida already. I'd seen how that parish operates, and I'd seen about how things are going. And I was, starting and running the English mission at the time, and I would say to people, well, the Australians do this. Oh, the Hungarians did this. No, the Americans did this. And of course, most of those people have never traveled around those places. They've never seen those places. And they'll say, well, you always talk about what the Australians are doing. Good for the Australians. You were talking about what the Hungarians are doing. Good for the Hungarians. Oh, the Americans. Well, they've just got loads of money, haven't they? Good for them. But now I'm bringing this up because we can learn from what other people have done, and we can take advantage of what they have discovered, what works and what doesn't work. Now, there are some things the Americans would do in the UK that wouldn't work, but there are other things that we can learn from. But Australia is a very, very close culture to Britain, because basically Brits live in a sunny place with a slightly different accent, and that a lot of Americans cannot tell the difference between us. But you can learn a lot if you're in touch, and nowadays, because of modern communication, you can make contact with Australians easily over the internet. You can make contact with Hungarians and Americans easily over the internet, so we can learn from each other. And I think that there is this kind of ingrained resentment, in Britain, that other people have it better. Well, yeah, other people have it better. And they have schools and stuff because people in those countries have made an enormous sacrifice to make those things happen. And if you're not prepared to if you don't do what they do, you're not going to have what they have. It's very, very straightforward. And I know that British Catholics, like English Catholics, are going to be looking at me saying, "Well, that's okay for you, mate. You live in Florida. You like living here." Let's be honest, one of the epicenters of Catholicism in the world. In this tiny little corner of Florida. That's true. But that's more by, God's providence than anything I did about it. I just happened to, that was how the cards felt. It's not like we got in the line and we all said that we wanted to move to Florida and I just got my name drawn out of a hat and I got picked.
Yeah, Matt just sat somewhere at an ordination. And,
That is true. But I had to fly to Italy to do it. Yeah, again, I went to Italy and see how the INDC did things in Peru. So, things can happen and you can learn and you can make things happen. But you have to have agency. You have to do it. And I know the UK is in a pretty pretty bad state at the moment. You know, I follow what's going on at home as much as I can, and I visited last October, and I was kind of horrified by the state of the place, particularly the roads. But you can still get stuff done. You know, that's we can still learn from each other, and we can still do stuff. And where there's a will, there's a way. And Frankie's right. You know, you got to figure out how you can make things happen rather than, you know, list all the excuses where they might not work.
No, exactly. I mean, I want to finish up by saying, you know, Britain was the place where the Industrial Revolution kicked off. And yes, it was, you could say, because of some Protestant attitudes towards commerce and things. But I think it's also because partly due to, you know, talented people in Britain doing what they were talented at and, you know, experimenting and trying new things. I think it's human to see, okay, what are we not doing? How can we do it? You know, so I don't think it's over. I think, you know, there is a chance to come back. I think Britain can, you know, I'm not saying we have to be some big empire again, but in what really matters, in the faith, then something can be built again. And I would encourage any young men listening, especially in Britain, to work hard and try new things. And if they turn out to be successful, you know, try and help out the mission if they can. And
do not be ashamed of having money. Don't be ashamed of it. Go and look at Patek Philippe, the Swiss watch company, Catholic company.
No, absolutely.
They don't sell cheap watches.
Frankie, are you advocating to make Britain great again?
I would say make Britain great again. And this has just come to mind. There's actually, I think he's aligned with the Society of St. Pius X or some indult group in France. But there's some French billionaire who's involved in a private equity, I think, Pierre something. And one of the projects he's doing now is to found a chain of Catholic schools. Now, he's not a sedevacantist, granted, you know, so I'm not saying send your children to his schools or something, but there's a real example of how someone's built themselves up. He didn't come from money, and he's been successful in his field, built businesses, improved them and sold them. And now he's doing something that, you know, on the surface at least, could benefit a lot of people with his money. So I would encourage people, not necessarily in the same field and so on, but, you know, that's how we're going to build up in England in particular our mission. It's by people being successful and kind of sharing the fruits of that success with the mission. So I don't know if anyone had anything else to add, but other than that, it was great to speak to you both today and to get your input on the differences between all of our respective countries. And to the viewers, thank you very much for tuning in.
Thanks for having us, Frankie.
Thank you.
All right.